Welcome to video 4 in my abridged version of Graham K. Griffiths' 2003 publication, Behold Jerusalem. In addition to his work, I'll be looking at the areas that Graham chose not to include in his book. In this video, I'll be looking at the lower or southern part of the Albion Zodiac. Graham starts his search for his Holy Grail of finding the 12 symbols of the zodiac, with the 4 most identifiable symbols, the giants of his childhood that he recognised in the Glastonbury zodiac. These are Virgo, Leo, Pisces and Sagittarius. As mentioned in my previous videos, the Albion zodiac and the Glastonbury zodiac differ slightly from Ptolemy's modern zodiac. But what is the zodiac, and why do I insist on pushing its importance? Unfortunately, I have a tendency to join the dots without explaining the joins or the dots themselves. So I need to just revisit the basics to make sure everyone is clear about what we are looking at and why it is so important to me and you in our journey that I believe is the antidote to tyranny across the entire world. So let's start with the dots, or in this case, those points of light that are constantly overhead, day or night. The zodiac is made up of the constellations of the ecliptic, or the path the sun takes across the sky. The constellations themselves are a subjective construct, which basically means they are groupings of the stars, or our dots of light, which we see as groups or clusters. These groups have then been assigned an abstract image based upon the overall shape of the constellation and the position of the individual points of light within the cluster, giving meaningful images not related to their nature. Now this may just sound like mumbo jumbo or gobbledygook, but who hasn't looked up into the night skies and seen Ursula Major, the familiar string of 7 stars? You might know them as the Big Dipper or the Plough. You might even know them as the Pan and Handle. This constellation is easily identifiable and clear to see, and from this we can find the pole star, which is currently the closest star directly overhead of the North Pole and close to the celestial pole. Thus, we now have a compass and now know which way is north. This is a diagram from Hugh Evans' book, The Origins of the Zodiac, showing that over time the point directly over the North Pole moves in a circular motion. However, if we were at the North Pole with the pole star directly overhead and moved away from the pole star would start to appear lower in the skies. And if we continue to travel further away from the pole, we would eventually lose sight of the pole star and even Ursula Major. However, the constellations of the ecliptic are visible no matter where we are in the world. If you have sunshine in the day, you will see the constellations of the ecliptic at night, and even in the winter months, when you might not see the sun so often, you will always see some of the constellation of the ecliptic. The only time you might not see the constellations of the ecliptic is when the sun never sets. This only happens in relatively small areas inside the Arctic or Antarctic Circle during the middle of summer at those locations. These subjective constructs are not related to the nature of the stars, but to the nature of the mind and the world around us. We can say that these constructs are pareidolia, which is our mind's interpretation to find meaning or form in inanimate objects. That is to say that a subjective construct requires an intelligent mind. We can say that the symbols of the zodiac require intelligence to exist, but also intelligence to interpret their symbolism back to their origin and understand that the unrelated images are now representations of the dots in the sky and can identify those points of light that gave birth to their form in a kind of reversed pareidolia process. It takes intelligence to see and identify intelligence in all its forms and guises, and to be able to identify, perform pareidolia and reversed pareidolia. Now we have established the intelligence of the symbols, and as I mentioned in my previous videos, these symbols aid knowledge, learning and recall whilst becoming an aid to navigation and representing a calendar to enable planting of crops and many other activities. We can move on to the intelligence of the design of the Albion zodiac. Now you may say it shows no intelligence as it fails to observe the positions of the constellations relative to each other in the night sky, as might be seen in other landscape zodiacs like Glastonbury. However, I say that it is the absolute opposite. It shows a greater intelligence because it not only gives these subjective constructs new life, it literally places them in the landscape in a creative and artistic form. We have plenty of maps and designs with pinpoint accuracy that place our dots of light relative to each other, but to give the symbols life and meaning outside of that celestial order and to introduce a little chaos makes them more interesting and accessible to everyone. This placement appears to have taken on a life of its own too, with many myths and legends seemingly being played out in the landscape. And I am in no doubt that this grand design is the definitive mythological repository, literally setting these myths and legends in stone. Is this then the origin of the phrase set in stone, or is this merely an example of that phrase? After all, to perform such a grand task over a vast area would surely not be your first attempt or trial of a process, nor would that knowledge totally disappear from history. For those that have seen my Starfort series, you will remember this is not the first time I have addressed the phrase set in stone, and I feel that this knowledge still exists and has a crude, possibly inferior process might still be in use in construction today in the form of the common house brick. I do not believe the Albion zodiac is unique in its construction, and I believe there are many examples of designer landscapes, both bigger and smaller. I am not saying that all land above sea level today is man-made, but the evidence of the Albion zodiac suggests that we may need to rethink what we might assume to be naturally random land formations. Today, I found St. George, and he was firmly sat upon a dragon's head. But this was outside the boundaries of the Albion zodiac, so I need to finish this series before I start exploring further afield. I'm sure there will be plenty more stories hidden within the landscape, and I hope to resurrect these stories and bring them back into the public consciousness. In video 3, we looked at Cancer, the Ark. The fear of rising seas was a driving factor behind Graham K. Griffiths' 2003 published work, Behold Jerusalem. Graham had originally found Mary Kane's book about Catherine Maltwood's discovery of the Glastonbury landscape zodiac and recognised Virgo, Leo, Pisces and Sagittarius as the giants in the landscape of England that he had seen as a child some 30 years earlier. He spent the next 10 years looking for and identifying the other 8 symbols of the zodiac. He actually found 9. He interpreted his findings as a message for our times that we needed to fight the alleged imminent climate crisis and rising sea levels. Personally, born in the late 60s, and to quote my best friend in Cyprus, I don't buy that, buddy. However, I do trust the observations and findings of many, including myself, that sea levels have risen in the past with a major event around 10,000 years ago. Since then, they have risen only slightly, and evidence of this was cited in my 10th Starfort video in my Our Story playlist. Links will be at the end of this video. But returning to the Albion Zodiac, my current feelings are that the major flood event was a factor in the creation of these artificial islands we now call the British Isles. Calling upon Hugh Evans' published work, The Origin of the Zodiac, once again, and choosing his diagrams, we can see that sea levels rose sharply, and I feel this would have prompted the indigenous population to build up the land to accommodate themselves and wildlife. Graham implies that the arc of Cancer was the landscape itself, and this could well be the idea that initially drove the construction and the design of the Albion Zodiac. And again, we have to consider which came first. Is the landscape a record of this event using the symbols of the zodiac, or is it the origin of the arc stories that exist in many cultures around the world to this day? As I keep saying, the design shows intelligence and knowledge that has been passed down through our history, be that set in stone, in lost or hidden written testaments, or verbal traditions. So faced with impending doom 10,000 years ago, which may or may not have been known about prior to its creation, did the indigenous population of the area we now call the British Isles set about creating a new raised land to accommodate themselves and other creatures as a life preserver? Albion's history, now mostly forgotten, tells of the story of a land of giants. One even gave his name to the land, Albion. Now let's pack our animals into the hold of Cancer for a moment and imagine that our ark has been cast adrift in a vast wash of a biblical deluge. Initially, I wasn't going to mention Libra in this video, but I think after all I've just said, it would be churlish to ignore our dove of peace, our bearer of the olive branch, and an integral part of any ark story or quest for the Holy Grail. Libra, defined by Ptolemy's work, is a set of scales, but astrological terms, Libra is an air sign. They're outgoing and sociable, peacemakers, caring, loving, even flighty. That sounds more like a dove than a set of scales to me. The Bible often refers to doves to portray purity, but also representing God's guidance and even the Holy Spirit. It is said that after the death of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, his mother, travelled to Britain with Joseph of Arimathea, carrying the Holy Grail, and their first stop was at the White Isle. Chapter 1 of Behold Jerusalem goes into greater depth of the symbolism of the Isle of Wight, the dove, and the ark. As at Glastonbury then, we have the dove to represent the constellation of Libra. Albion's representation is by far the smallest symbol, but nevertheless, he is an integral part of our zodiac, clearly defined entirely by coastline, although Graham felt that if we traced a few features of the landscape, it would be more pleasing and in keeping with the Glastonbury symbol. Libra's position may initially seem out of place as I present the three symbols above him, but if we interpret that, as with Noah's story, the dove has been sent out to find land, then we might say he is returning from a flight across the deluge. Or maybe, as we see with seagulls, he's dancing in the wake of the great ark itself, maybe in the hopes of catching a fish or two. Which leads us nicely into that most giant of fish, certainly in comparison to Libra, that wise salmon, Pisces. Once again, mostly defined by the coastline of Cornwall and Devon. And once again, I find Graham's work on identifying the inland head is wonderful, and his explanation and tales back to mythological, biblical stories, and his research in general has to be applauded. Then there is the genius of the position of Glastonbury and its zodiac. And once again, this is phenomenal. Why? Well, Glastonbury itself was once marshland. This again starts to make the whole landscape come alive. And this is not the only place where we find a wet marsh exactly where it is needed to be. But the Glastonbury landscape zodiac is perfectly placed to form the eye of our giant Pisces. And in a grand design of the Albion zodiac, we are effectively seeing a reflection of the skies in the watery, starry, gazy eye of Pisces. These coincidences keep turning up, so often in fact that we need to consider that they can no longer be considered as coincidence, but totally by design, a design so intelligent that it initially blows our minds. And once again, I reiterate the statement that drives my own video productions. I'm making these videos to change the way you think, because almost everything you have been taught was designed to program you to stop thinking critically and accept everything you are told as truth without question. Moving eastwards from Pisces and overlapped by the head of Pisces, we come to the western side of that super mare, Capricorn. And uncoincidentally, western super mare sits on the mane of the goatfish. So why am I so enthusiastic over a goat with a mane, and why am I insisting on calling it a mare? Well, if you know about the constellations, you may be aware that the definition of the constellation of Capricorn actually only shows the line of one set of stars for a horn, not two horns. Our Capricorn has a little stump of a horn that is Portland Bill, or the island of Portland at Weymouth. And again, I will refer you to chapter 3 in Graham's work for more details. But in Greek mythology, there is only one cornucopia, the horn of plenty, that nurtures Zeus, given by the divine goat Amalthea, but the horn is always mentioned in the singular. You may not be aware that some say the unicorn had a face of a goat, and some say that it had a fish tail. So, a goatfish might have been the mythical unicorn, or even the original seahorse. I'm sure you've seen pictures of galloping horses on the crest of a wave, so if they had a fishtail, this seems not so implausible after all. So a horsefish with a head more in keeping with a goat and a single horn seems to be what is depicted in both Glastonbury and the Albion Zodiac, and not Ptolemy's two-horned goat. So stretching from Canterbury in the east to Weston-super-Mare in the west, we have a giant goatfish unicorn. And at this point, I want to throw in the theory that not only was the landscape zodiac constructed, but in fact it would have been in glorious technicolor too. The pure white cliffs of the Dove and the southern coastline that makes a unicorn pure brilliant white too are just part of it. And just a quick flick back to Virgo and her crown, as I showed this crown with a headband, and you may find this unbelievable, but it seems that there is evidence of it being technicolor there too. And Anglesey was once the largest copper mine in Europe, and the history of copper mining in Anglesey seems to stretch back for more than 6,000 years. That's a lot of copper. And just to prove this chalk under the grass of our unicorn, the majority of chalk horses found in the landscape of the British Isles are found on the head or on the mane of Capricorn. Now back down to the south coast, and as we head east and turn the corner in Kent, we find Dover with more white cliffs. These cliffs for me mark the starting point of my journey into the Albion Zodiac. It was Paul Cook's video that got me thinking about the lay of the land, and then Darren Cole, one of my subscribers, who pointed me in the direction of Graham K. Griffiths' book, Behold Jerusalem. In Graham's book, Dover is the starting point of his second chapter about Sagittarius. And just a quick reminder that his book is available in its entirety in the Albion Landscape Zodiac playlist linked at the end of this video. Graham shows the whole of the southern east coastline from the Wash down and round to Dover as the face and hand of a giant with his eye near a town called Eye in Suffolk. There are several references within Graham's book telling of giants helping to save fleets of boats by walking ahead, submerged in the water, and I seem to recall something similar in Gulliver's Travels too, but I think in that case he was actually stealing the boats. However, the myths and legends Graham's cites, the giant is giving advice and guidance to the fleet, and this submerged position in front of the boat may have even given rise to figureheads on the front of ships to ward off evil spirits, or as suggested in the case of the Viking ships, even to terrorise people as they approached. Mary Kane even suggested a figurehead appeared in the Glastonbury Zodiac on the Ark of Cancer too. So this is the south coast and the lower elements of the main body of the Albion Zodiac. And as I pointed out at the end of video 3, these all sit on or below the waterline of the arc, pictorially at least. And if we imagine now some colour in the imagery, we find that Capricorn is now leaping over and forming the foaming wake of the bow, whilst Pisces is swimming off the stern in the wake of the arc and Capricorn, whilst our giant figurehead guides our arc on its journey. One question that I have been asked and I feel needs to be explained a little more is, why did I call the series The Antidote to Tyranny? Well, I feel that the control of knowledge is the easiest way to gain tyrannical rule by stealth. In his book 1984, George Orwell states, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Noam Chomsky says, "He who controls the media controls the minds of the public." And one final quote from Mark Crispin Miller: "Media manipulation in the US today is more effective than it was in Nazi Germany, because here we have the pretense that we are getting all the information we want. That misconception prevents people from even looking for the truth." So I say the withholding of knowledge and or control of the education system by the same people trying to impose their control over you can bring about tyranny without you being aware. Therefore, this evidence or truth of such a grand scale as the British Isles is hard to hide or disprove without literally removing the entire British Isles from the face of the earth, and it becomes the truth they can no longer deny. With the knowledge of the Albion Zodiac, then, comes the biggest single piece of evidence that your education, history, and even geology is a lie, or that information is being withheld by those that wish to enslave you into their tyrannical world. Alternatively, you are suffering Stockholm Syndrome and agree that the random doodles of nature is capable of intelligent design that can only be interpreted by those with knowledge of the subjective constructs of the constellations, and that they have themselves produced a system of recall and recognition of these symbols that coincidentally matches these random shapes. In other words, nature has randomly produced hundreds of miles of coastline that have randomly given us something that is only recognizable to an intelligent imagination that has been looking at the stars for over 50,000 years and found them in the coastline of the British Isles. The fact we now have 14 recognizable cosmologically connected symbols, and each one contributes to the outline of the coastline, and each of the 14 is identifiable from that contribution to the coastline alone without using any roads or other man-made lines or boundaries, although the roads may well have been defined in harmony with the landscape or with knowledge of the underlying forms. We, or at least I, can say without a shadow of a doubt that pareidolia it is not. Naturally formed, it is not. It is clearly by design, and an extremely intelligent design at that. Thus, the Albion Zodiac is and will be the antidote to tyranny across the world. And there you go. Join me next time as we'll be looking at the northwest coastline of the Albion Zodiac.